In the years following the Second World War, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were rubble. Entire nations were rebuilding. And yet, on the dusty circuits and country roads of the continent, a new obsession was taking root, one that would define the sport of motor racing for generations to come. By 1951, the World Championship had already begun its first faltering steps. But it was a young Argentine driver, brought to Europe by chance and circumstance, who would transform Formula One from a gentleman's pursuit into something altogether more primal and thrilling. His name was Juan Manuel Fangio, and across the next decade, he would reshape the very meaning of dominance in motorsport. Fangio arrived in Europe relatively late in his career, already in his 40s, carrying with him years of racing through the roads and dirt tracks of South America. What he brought was something the European drivers had never quite seen before: a precision, a ruthlessness, and an intuitive understanding of the machine beneath him that bordered on the supernatural. He drove for ALFA Romeo in those early seasons, cars that were elegant in their simplicity, crude by modern standards, yet formidable in the right hands. And Fangio's hands were the rightest in the world. By 1952, Alfa Romeo's grip on the championship was beginning to slip. The Italian marque had dominated, yes, but the tide was turning. Faster cars were emerging from across Europe, and the margin of Fangio's superiority, though still vast, demanded something more than brilliance alone. It was then that Mercedes-Benz entered the fray. The German manufacturer, rebuilding itself from the ashes of war just as Europe was, saw Formula One as the ultimate proof of resurrection. They arrived not as gentlemen racers, but as engineers with a singular mission: to prove that German innovation and precision could reclaim its place at the pinnacle of motorsport. For Fangio, the opportunity was irresistible. In 1954, he signed with Mercedes. And what followed was not a mere championship campaign. It was a masterclass in automotive dominance that would remain unmatched for decades to come. The Mercedes W154 was a revelation. Low-slung, beautifully proportioned, equipped with fuel injection when others still relied on carburetors, it represented a leap forward so profound that some rivals could barely comprehend it. But it was Fangio who made it transcendent. That season of 1954 would become the stuff of legend. Not because the Mercedes was invincible, but because Fangio drove it as if he possessed knowledge the machine itself had not yet discovered. He won the championship with a margin so commanding that even his own team struggled to keep pace. 5 victories from 12 races, a points haul that left his nearest rival, the British driver Stirling Moss, nearly 50 points adrift. Yet it was not the victories that defined that year. It was a single race, the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, where Fangio would produce a performance so audacious, so utterly without precedent, that it would enter motorsport folklore as perhaps the greatest display of driving skill ever witnessed. The Nürburgring in 1954 was not the modern circuit we know today. It was the old Nordschleife, 14 miles of unforgiving road course, part racetrack, part genuine public highway, a ribbon of tarmac that wound through the green hills of the Eifel region with barely a barrier to catch the unwary. Fangio started from third on the grid. His car was fast, certainly, but not fast enough to challenge the 2 Maseratis ahead. What happened next would reshape forever how the world understood the relationship between driver, machine, and will. In the opening laps, Fangio sat behind the Maseratis, studying them, learning their rhythm, understanding where they were quick and where they were vulnerable. This was the hunter's patience, not desperation, but the cold calculation of a man who knew his prey. Then, on lap 17, he made his move. A breathless, overtaking maneuver on one of the Maseratis at a corner that left spectators gasping. The second fell soon after. Fangio was now leading, but the gap behind was closing. The Maserati drivers, spurred on by pride and proximity, began to press. What happened next defied belief. For the remaining laps of that race, Fangio drove the Nürburgring as if possessed by something beyond mere mortal skill. He carved lines through the Eifel forest that had never been driven before. He braked later than any driver dared. He accelerated earlier out of corners with such conviction that the rear tires seemed to dance on the edge of catastrophe. The Mercedes, pushed to a level of aggression it was never designed for, began to fail. His engine misfiring, his suspension groaning, his tires worn to the canvas. Fangio drove a dying machine for nearly 100 miles, every lap faster than the lap before, holding off the Maseratis through pure will and an understanding of physics that bordered on the mystical. He crossed the line less than a second ahead. The crowd erupted, but it was not merely a victory. It was a statement, carved into the asphalt of the Nürburgring, that would echo through the sport for generations to come. Fangio had shown the world not just that he could win. He had shown that he could transcend the machine itself. That September afternoon at the Nürburgring would live forever in the memory of everyone who witnessed it, not as a mere victory, but as a watershed moment in motorsport history. Journalists and rival drivers alike struggled to find words adequate to the scale of what they had seen. One British correspondent wrote simply, "We have witnessed something that transcends sport." The legend had begun to harden into something immutable, something that would outlast the machines themselves. For Mercedes, the significance was equally profound. Here was the proof they had sought, that German engineering, paired with the greatest driver of the age, could not merely compete on equal terms, but could dominate, could inspire, could lead. Fangio's 5 victories that season secured his second world championship, but the numbers alone told only half the story. What mattered was the manner of his dominance, the way he had elevated the art of racing to something approaching poetry, the way he had driven not just to win races, but to rewrite what was thought possible behind a racing wheel. The 1954 season was the zenith of Fangio's partnership with Mercedes, a moment when driver and machine achieved a fusion so complete that they seemed almost to anticipate one another's thoughts. Yet the championship itself was merely the crown upon an edifice of greatness already constructed. The true measure of that season lay not in the silverware, but in what Fangio had revealed about the sport's very nature. For in those months at the wheel of the Mercedes, he had demonstrated something that transcended the conventional wisdom of motor racing. That the driver, when possessed of sufficient will and understanding, could elevate a machine beyond its engineering limitations. The rest of the Formula One world had watched, learned, and understood that the gap between Fangio and his peers was not merely inches or tenths of a second. It was a chasm of comprehension, a fundamental difference in how the man perceived the physics of speed itself. Back in Stuttgart, the engineers at Daimler-Benz knew what they had witnessed in Fangio. They had built a fast car, yes, but they had paired it with a driver who had transformed it into an instrument of art. By season's end, there was no longer any question who was the greatest racing driver of his generation. The question now was simply this: would anyone ever match what Fangio had achieved? In the winter that followed, as the racing world took breath and reflected upon what had unfolded across that golden season, a peculiar phenomenon began to take hold. Young drivers, watching films of Fangio's performances, studied them not as victories, but as lessons, as blueprints for a new grammar of racing that he alone had authored. They tried to replicate his lines. They could not. They mimicked his aggression. It was recklessness in their hands. For what Fangio possessed could not be taught in a classroom or absorbed from a cinema seat. It existed in the synapses of his nervous system, in the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent at speed. Yet something had shifted in the sport's consciousness. Fangio was no longer simply the best driver. He had become the measure against which all others would be judged. Mercedes had glimpsed something too, that their investment in this aging Argentine had yielded returns far beyond horsepower or lap time. In Fangio, they had found not merely a driver, but a conduit through which engineering excellence could speak to the world. As 1955 dawned, there remained one final act to be written in this extraordinary partnership. The Mercedes W196 sat in the Stuttgart workshops, faster still, more refined than before. And Fangio, now in his mid-40s, prepared to prove once more that the greatest driver of his age had not yet finished writing his legend.